It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi.
Well, we're going to kick off our show by welcoming David Cay Johnston. He is a professor and journalist and longtime chronicler of Donald Trump's shady escapades. He founded the site DC Report, which describes what the president and Congress do, not just what they say. And he's going to expound upon Donald Trump's ongoing crime spree. It's always fun to have David Cay Johnston on. And that's just the first part of the show. In the second half of the show, we're going to talk about corporate denial. The great muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair once said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." This has never been truer when we talk about the oil industry. After decades of apparently not understanding, ExxonMobil has finally acknowledged that there is a climate crisis. Promising news, except ExxonMobil hasn't actually changed anything they're doing. They say they recognize that a warming planet is a tremendous disruption to human life on the planet, but they aren't acting like it. They haven't cut production, and they're still funding people and organizations who deny the crisis. And Exxon is just one example of corporate denial, but there are also many corporations who have been running ruthless campaigns to undermine science, deny evidence, rationalize their harmful activities in many other areas throughout history. Our first guest, Barbara Freese, has a long history of taking on corporate denial. As an environmental attorney, she cross-examined coal industry witnesses who are disputing the science of climate change. Her new book, Industrial Strength Denial, explores corporate denial by delving into 8 examples. In between, we will, as always, take some time to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk about Donald Trump's latest crime spree. David?
David Cay Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and author of 6 books, including The Making of Donald Trump. He has lectured on economics, journalism, and tax policy on every continent except Antarctica. Mr. Johnston's reporting persuaded 2 presidents to change their tax policies and stop tax dodges that Congress valued at more than $250 billion. He is also the founder and editor of DC Report, a nonprofit news service that reports what the president and Congress do, not what they say. And his latest book is entitled, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Cay Johnston.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Well, let's get to the nub of it, David. All his business career and his political career, Donald J. Trump has escaped the reach of the law in a remarkable series of maneuvers and bankruptcies and protections by the Justice Department and many other things that have been reported on. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said publicly, Donald Trump is a liar, a thief, and a crook. He should be in prison. Those are the exact words. Why is he still at large?
Well, in a perverse way, Ralph, I admire Donald for his ability to do 2 things. There are 3 of them I admire him for in a perverse way. He has been unbelievably successful in defeating law enforcement his entire life because he's the 3rd generation head of a 4-generation crime family. He's beaten at least 4 grand juries when he was in his 30s. He's escaped responsibility time after time, sometimes through threats and intimidation, sometimes through telling the government, go ahead, come after me, and I'll use up all your resources. And because white-collar crime laws are incredibly weak in America. If we treated having a corporation, which is overall a very beneficial thing to do to get people to take risks and create wealth and hire people, but if we treated it as the privilege that it is, and we're serious about people who abuse that privilege, Donald Trump would have gone to prison before he had any gray hair. The second thing he's masterful at is getting people to believe the utter nonsense that he's a businessman. He is not a businessman. Business people create wealth. They add to assets. Donald Trump is an extractor. He mines things. He gets control of a business, and then he sucks it dry, doesn't pay his bills, doesn't pay his workers, vendors, puts small businesses out of business, cheats the government on taxes and fees that he owes, and then walks away with a pile of money. Indeed, that's the point of the art of the deal. There's always another sucker or another government or business deal that he can make. And the third thing, since I mentioned, is Donald is masterful in knowing how the conventions of journalism can be abused to his benefit. Only in the last few months have I started to see my former newspaper, the New York Times, instead of pussyfooting around and treating him as a normal politician, start to write, as Trump said falsely yesterday, things like that, just saying this isn't true, the things he's saying. Would that they had done that when I pleaded with him to do that 4 years ago.
Well, what's interesting, and we're talking with David Cay Johnston. I've called him the greatest tax reporter in the country. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it in the New York Times. He knows more about Donald J. Trump's business career than anybody, and he has been monitoring his performance in government very, very closely. And let's see if you agree with this. I think if he loses the election in the interregnum of 77 days, where he'll really go crazy, benefiting his family, his cronies, and shoveling out all kinds of non-enforcement rules, that if he loses the election, he will resign during the interregnum, have Pence become president, pardon him for specific federal crimes. And a pardon, you have to admit to a whole series of federal criminal violations, and go down to Mar-a-Lago and then fight the New York district attorney for umpteen number of years. Is that a credible scenario?
I would disagree with you only a little on the margins, Ralph. I have written that we shouldn't be surprised if on the morning of January 20th, Trump resigns, Mike Pence is sworn in, and Pence grants him a pardon. And the reason for that is it's very clear. I think you'll agree with me, and you're a lawyer, I just teach law, that the Supreme Court will never uphold a self-pardon. You can't miss that in the opening of Chief Justice Roberts' decision this summer about Trump and the subpoenas from the New York grand jury, not for Trump, but for the accounting firm that he uses. But the water would be real unclear if he were to resign and Pence were to do it, and I don't know whether the courts would say that's a sham and reject it. I don't think in the 77 days of transition that we'll see Trump do as much as you might fear, simply because he's lazy and he isn't competent. I mean, if Donald Trump were competent, when he took office, the first thing he would have done was put forth a huge infrastructure bill. The Democrats would have had to go along with it, and it would have created a lot of jobs and improved the physical environment. We'd be 3.5 years into it now, and we wouldn't have as many potholes on highways and things like that. And he never has done that. It's a mirage that he's a businessman, that he knows what he's doing. He has no idea what he's doing. In fact, I predicted in early 2017 in writing that if a virus were to hopscotch around the planet on jetliners and create a pandemic like the one that killed his grandfather in 1918, Trump would not know what to do. Well, that's exactly what we've seen going on. I do think there will be some adverse actions. He will certainly, if he loses and knows that he's going to have to go one way or another, that he'll pardon Jared Kushner, he'll pardon his daughter, he'll pardon his sons. People who he thinks are loyal to him, he will pardon them left and right. But how much more damage he'll do in the regulation area, he's a lazy guy. I think he'll do some, but not a great deal.
Well, he is not a very hard worker at his appointed tasks, that's for sure. But it's easy to stop law enforcement. It's easy to shovel out unexpended monies to businesses, corporate welfare. You know, he's got his henchmen in charge. But I think what the listeners are really looking forward to in this interview is Donald Trump, his secret tax returns, and what the state district attorney in New York is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's just a function of time, Ralph. The New York State Attorney General is pursuing what is basically a garden variety tax fraud case against Donald Trump. And I was floored when all sorts of news organizations a couple of months ago said, oh, they've expanded the investigation. The subpoenas have always been for documents dating to 2011. So clearly they went way beyond the hush money payments to the two women. We know from my work and from the New York Times' extraordinary October 2018 project where Mary Trump, we now know, gave them all these records, that Donald is a calculated, serious tax thief. And in the current case in New York, the criminal case, the grand jury and the prosecutors already know Donald Trump's federal tax information because the New York state trades, as all the states do, information with the IRS. And your New York state tax return, which the grand jury would have, is essentially identical to your federal tax return. What they don't have are the business records and the communications. And I'll tell you from past things I've written about what they're going to find when they finally get the records from the Mazars accounting firm. And they apparently already have some records, but they will eventually get more from the Trump organization, although Donald routinely destroys records. They're going to show that Donald issued instructions. You know, he's been tried twice for income tax fraud, which is a story I'm the only person who's reported, and I have not been able to get the New York Times, the Washington Post, or anybody else to report on. He had 2 income tax fraud trials. He lost them both. And in those cases, he made claims that were absolutely absurd, and he had issued orders in another case involving rents. He owed the city of New York for the Hyatt Hotel, his first big project in Midtown Manhattan, which was in Midtown Manhattan, to pay less and not pay what he owed. And they're going to have at the Mazars firm drafts of tax returns and communications or memos to the file, most likely, saying, you know, Mr. Trump says that that's too much money. He won't pay that much in tax. And the accountants who went along with this are at risk of their licenses. So they're going to absolutely turn state's evidence when push comes to shove to save their licenses, unless they're already retired, and then they can be pressured with the threat of being prosecuted.
Well, tell us before we conclude what the Manhattan District Attorney's case is going to be, because that's considered a real peril for Donald Trump and his associates.
Yes, absolutely. And what Trump is trying to do is delay, and run out the clock on some charges. The Manhattan District Attorney's case is fundamentally a garden variety tax fraud case. They are undoubtedly looking at Donald's business records at the Trump organization, his filings with banks like Deutsche Bank, his filings with the state government, not matching up with what's on his tax returns. And I've documented in the past Donald doing this repeatedly, keeping essentially 2 sets of books, I mean that in the most pejorative sense possible, and lying and denying and cheating. And once they've got the Mazars USA accounting firm's records and files, which the firm says they'll turn over as soon as there's a final court order, I believe it will just a matter of time until you see Donald Trump and probably some other people around him and the Trump organization as a corporation indicted on state tax crimes. You may also see a racketeering case. New York State has a racketeering law. It has somewhat higher standards than the federal law, that it's a little more difficult to bring. But instead of 2 criminal acts, you have to show 3. Little changes like that. And I will not be the least bit surprised if the grand jury returns a racketeering indictment. And that reason that would trouble Trump and his family is if you're convicted of aggravated criminal enterprise. And that's, by the way, what I believe the Trump organization has always been. It's not a business. It's a criminal enterprise posing as a business. They can seize every dollar that came from it. They can go and take away Don Jr.'s house because all of his money comes from there, or nearly all of it. And you can get 15 to 25 years in prison. And Donald Trump is going to scream and yell about being tried in New York. One of the complaints is he'll want to be tried, no doubt, in Albany, where you'll recall that's where police officers accused of murdering people through bad tactics and misconduct always try to get tried in Albany.
Well, you know, Trump has defied over 100 congressional subpoenas, which is an impeachable offense if it ever was one. And he's gotten away with it because he has William Barr as his special lawyer, a.k.a. the Attorney General of the United States. If he gets a pardon by President Pence sometime in January for his federal crimes, which he has to consent to committing to get the pardon. A lot of people don't know that. You just don't get a blank pardon.
Under a 1925 Supreme Court case called Burdick, if you accept a pardon, you are admitting you committed felonies against the United States.
Correct.
And, you know, when he gave one to Joe Arpaio, the horrible sheriff out in Phoenix, Arpaio said, "What are you talking about? I never confessed anything." No, you don't have to accept a pardon. Burdick wouldn't accept one on principle.
Yeah.
And if Donald Trump accepts a pardon, he's admitting he's a criminal.
And he's shameless. He doesn't care as long as he gets a pardon. But the one place he can't escape is New York City and New York State. The Attorney General of New York State and the Manhattan District Attorney. Is that correct?
Absolutely. He cannot escape that, changing his official residence to Florida, where, by the way, he agreed in a formal court proceeding that he would never treat Mar-a-Lago as his residence. So his residency even there is in question. He cannot escape the New York prosecutors. And I believe that Trump is liable, if prosecutors wanted to pursue this, in California, where Xavier Becerra, the Attorney General, has talked about going after Trump, in Connecticut and in New Jersey and perhaps other states for acts that he's undertaken. Even in Florida, where, you know, Trump has engaged in a number of business deals with Russian criminals, where when I and other people have examined those deals, they make no sense as business deals, but they make perfect sense if you think of them as money laundering or payoffs.
And just in conclusion, Trump has bragged about him being worth $10 billion. And somebody said, "Where is it?" And they said, "Well, the trade name, the Trump Towers, the trade name around the world." You think he's worth well under $1 billion, don't you?
Right. Yeah, I do. And in fact, when Trump became president and filed his disclosure form, he listed assets that by the most generous interpretation are only $1.4 billion. So about 85% of what he claimed during the campaign somehow vanished in the 77 days between the election in 2016 and when he was sworn in January of 2017. It's all a fraud. It's all smoke and mirrors. Trump is always desperate for cash. He needs cash. You can pose the lifestyle that he has as a billionaire with your 757 jet, which isn't worth much. For if you have $20 million a year of cash, you could do it just fine. No one could tell you apart from a real billionaire. And that's the reality of this. Donald never has had that kind of money. I mean, what actual billionaire, multi-billionaire, is out there hawking steaks and vodka and brand name water and creating a fraudulent university that's really a scam to cheat people? No real billionaire does those things. Among other things, you wouldn't want to expose yourself to the litigation. Donald is a criminal. He's always been a criminal. His family came to America as criminals. You know, his grandfather lied to get his citizenship and ran poorhouses in Washington State and the Yukon Territory. And God only knows what he was doing when he died in New York City. But he was a very wealthy man whose only obvious business was a little tiny cigar shop in Manhattan. Give me a break. That's a front for something else. His father was a thief who stole from the taxpayers. President Eisenhower, who had the horrible moral decision to send all those young men to their deaths on Omaha Beach, he put 100 investigators onto Fred Trump. And Donald has, throughout his career, managed to get away by ratting out other people, by lying and denying, by running out the clock. I mean, he was well advised by Roy Cohn, the horrible, monstrous Roy Cohn, on how to defeat law enforcement. And this shows us something very important, Ralph, that's way beyond Donald Trump. We don't have adequate laws so that the privilege of using the corporate form is not turned into a vehicle for a criminal organization. I want to have corporations. I want people to be able to limit their liability so that they will invest and take risks and build wealth for everybody. But you shouldn't be able to use that as a tool to run a criminal enterprise, and yet we allow that all over the country, as you have been telling us and teaching us since I was a college student, in fact, a high school student. And we need to recognize that our white-collar crime laws are tissue paper. They're just absolute tissue paper. We need real laws, and honest business people, I believe, can be brought around to support that if we work at it. But it isn't even being discussed in the mainstream news.
Two quick questions. One, Michael Cohen, his fixer, is out with a book, Skyhorse Publishing, on September 8th. 600,000 copies have been printed in anticipation of a tell-all super bestseller. Do you think that's going to inconvenience Donald Trump?
Oh, yeah. I think that Michael Cohen is a real threat to Donald Trump. And let's remember, Donald Trump is the unindicted co-conspirator in the crimes for which Michael Cohen was sent to prison. He's a real danger to Donald. And in this book that just came out about Melania by the woman who was her designer friend, he is quoted as saying that of the $107 million that was raised for the Trump inaugural, which I wrote about at the time, how could anybody have spent $107 million? Obama didn't even spend the $50 million he raised for a much bigger gala. He's quoted as saying they stole $80 million of it, which sounds about right to me, that they could have stolen as much as $80 million. So the people around Trump, where did this money go? The woman herself, she got $26 million and has been made out to be the horrible person. She says, look, $25 million of that I immediately sent on to these other people as instructed. And $1 million fee for being the arranger of an inaugural is not an unreasonable fee. So Michael Cohen's statements there would be very revealing. And remember that Michael Cohen tape recorded Trump. He tape recorded other people. I'm sure his book will have some serious evidence. And that's why the New York prosecutors in the state court and the federal prosecutors who Trump has tried through Bill Barr to shut down have been talking to him all the way along. And by the way, another person Trump is going to want to pardon is Bill Barr, because otherwise I'd say he's highly likely to be the third United States Attorney General to go to prison. There needs to be, when this is over, a thorough reckoning. You know, the Obama administration came in and made a political decision not to pursue all the criminals at the banks. There should have been thousands of bankers and traders and others who went to prison, just as happened after the savings and loan crisis in 1992. But they wouldn't ever talk to the guy who knew how to bring these cases, Bill Black, so they could say that it really wasn't illegal what they did. Of course, it was illegal. Fraud is always and everywhere a crime. And it is the tradition in this country that the next administration doesn't go after the previous administration, although Trump did apparently, we now know, try to get Hillary Clinton investigated, and the Justice Department wouldn't do it. But even if we don't pursue the Trump people on criminal grounds federally in the new administration, we absolutely need to have a thorough reckoning. Here is what they did. Here are the records they destroyed. Here are the illegal acts they took. Here was Jared Kushner's role in the death of Adnan Khashoggi, which I think there's really good evidence to think occurred, as well as the rounding up of rich Saudis by the de facto dictator there. We need to have a thorough investigation of what went on during this administration, and then we need to look at constitutional remedies and the legal remedies we need, because an important line has been crossed. As I wrote in my last book, every president up till Donald Trump, and we've had murderous people like Andrew Jackson in the White House, every one of them did what they thought was good for the country. Donald Trump did what was good for Donald Trump and had no regard for the country except how it benefited him and helped him maintain power. Now that ethical line has been obliterated, there are other people out there looking at Donald Trump and saying, well, if I can get to the White House, I'm a hard worker, I have a serious philosophy, I know how to manage, I can take over the country and become dictator, because there are all these weaknesses in our system that is built on good faith. And I'm sorry we're going to have to do that, but if we don't do it, somebody else will come along, 4, 8, 10. You and I may be gone when it happens, but somebody will come along and they will take over this country and destroy our nation.
Well, they certainly lowered the bar for that kind of ascension, and it will still be called a democracy in form, but look at the enormous unconstitutional power and impeachable offenses that have led him to concentrate power in the White House more than any other previous president. I mean, Nixon was impeached, as you know, in the Watergate scandal for one obstruction of justice and one defiance of a subpoena, and Trump has done hundreds of these and gotten away with it.
Well, and that's one of the issues here is, look, we've had 4 cases, if you count Nixon, who wasn't actually impeached, but he would have been. And the system we have doesn't work. The system for constraining and removing a president, we've had 4 runs at it. It doesn't work. We need to change that system. We need to recognize that we need to update our Constitution in a lot of ways because it's an 18th century idea. It's very dangerous to do that because you put the wrong people in office, we could lose a lot of our First Amendment freedoms. We could become a theocracy. We could disincorporate the 14th Amendment. And there are people, as you know, Ralph, out there who want to repeal the 14th Amendment, including at least one member of Congress, Rand Paul. So it is a difficult thing to do. But now that we've seen how norms of behavior and the expectation that a president will act in the national interest can be totally perverted, we're going to have to address this, or down the road, we will pay a much worse price when a competent crook, Donald Trump is an incompetent crook except for beating law enforcement, gets into office.
Well, let's see if Congress, if it's controlled by a solid Democratic majority in January, will do its part. There have been some historic congressional investigations over the past 2 centuries, and Congress is in complicity here in a passive way, and it has the powerful impeachment power, and it has not been willing to use it except for the Ukraine matter, even in a House of Representatives controlled by Democrats.
One of the things we're seeing, by the way, is we're seeing that the Democrats who sold their souls to corporate America, who became Republican light, like the beer, L-I-T-E, that they're pretty much on the run. There is a big change taking place in this country. And the further down the age tree you go, the more people have said, hey, we've been through 40 years of Reaganism and supply-side economics and tax favors for the rich, and the only people benefiting are a tiny segment of the population at the top. That's not sustainable. It's going to change. It won't happen just in one election, but I think we're on the way to a different America, one that goes back to be more like we were under the New Deal, that Northern Europe is like, where you don't see homeless people and collapsing buildings and roads that are falling apart and education systems that don't work. I hope we're moving in that direction of fulfilling the idea that our Constitution is to ennoble the human spirit to see what human beings can achieve, and ending this domination of our culture by soulless corporations run by people whose incentives and legal belief, wrongly, that their only duty is to make money. And hopefully that will change. Hopefully we will see this as a turning point. If not, boy, the future for this country, the future for human freedom is really, really bleak.
All right. On that note, thank you very much. We've been talking to David Cay Johnston, who is, among his other books, has written a biography of Donald J. Trump and continues to monitor the lawlessness of the Trump regime. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Ralph. Steve. Take care.
We have been speaking with journalist David Cay Johnston. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a short break. When we return, we're going to talk about all the various forms of corporate denial, from the slave trade to climate denial. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 4, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Herbalife Nutrition will pay more than $122 million to resolve the government's investigation into violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The resolution arises out of Herbalife's scheme to falsify books and records and provide corrupt payments and benefits to Chinese government officials for the purposes of obtaining, retaining, and increasing Herbalife's business in China. Herbalife entered into a deferred prosecution agreement in connection with a criminal information filed in New York City. Herbalife approved the extensive and systemic corrupt payments to Chinese government officials over a 10-year period to promote and expand Herbalife's business in China, said U.S. Attorney Audrey Strauss. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Now let's talk about corporate denial through the ages. David?
Barbara Freese is an environmental attorney and a former Minnesota Assistant Attorney General. Her interest in corporate denial was sparked by cross-examining coal industry witnesses disputing the science of climate change. Ms. Freese is the author of Coal, A Human History, was a New York Times notable book. Her most recent book is Industrial Strength Denial, 8 Stories of Corporations Defending the Indefensible, from the slave trade to climate change. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Barbara Freese.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Welcome. As you describe your book in your introduction, you say, this book, quote, I'm quoting you, this book tells the stories of 8 major campaigns of corporate denial, a term I use to broadly include the lies, delusions, and rationalizations that emerge when people working in competitive, profit-driven group enterprises are faced with powerful evidence that they are causing harm, end quote. That is an understatement. Causing harm. The case studies you have destroyed the lives of tens of millions of people, increased injuries and illnesses by a much greater magnitude. Let's start with the slave trade.
Right. I focused on the British slave trade and the denials from the slave industry there because it struck me as this really appalling, early, and pretty pure example of industrial denial, because the British public did not know much about slavery. They basically only knew what the industry told them. But the British did dominate the slave trade in the late 1700s, and they ended up facing an abolition movement that was trying to make it clear to the British public just how incredibly brutal this trade was. And that prompted the industry to put together a very well-organized, orchestrated campaign of denial. And they did most of their denial in writing, so you can see what they've written. And if you dig through the literature, which is not for the weak of heart or weak of stomach, but I did it. And what you find was that they came back and basically created a complete counter narrative, a counter reality, if you will, describing how conditions were so terrible in Africa, and the Africans were eager to be purchased. They tried to sometimes market themselves to the slave traders to convince them that they should be purchased. They crossed the Atlantic on these comfortable, even festive slave ships. They ended up, the industry claimed, in these very comfortable plantations where all their needs were taken care of. It was kind of a cradle to grave welfare state. And so that was sort of their first response, the industry's first response, that they were not really enslaving these people so much as rescuing them from a fate in Africa that would have included being put to death as prisoners of war or eaten by cannibals or some such thing. So that was their first and I suppose most appalling approach. And what happened then was, because they characterized themselves as rescuing the Africans, they could characterize the abolitionists as shutting the gates of mercy on the Africans and actually characterize abolition of the slave trade as violent and unfair to the Africans. So it became just this crazy kind of bizarre world that they were trying to create. And
this we might want to inform our readers, the biggest people in the trade of slaves from Africa was the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, which had a lot of influence in England. And what was amazing is that this abolition movement, starting in England, within 20 years, the slave trade out of Liverpool in that triangle was banned, right? I mean, what was it, 1780-something to 1807? Just 20 years.
Yeah, in retrospect, it is just astonishing how quickly that actually worked for them and how well that worked. And yet, of course, that still gave them plenty of time to deny things and to sustain their industry and to deliver, I think it was something like another 250,000 Africans into slavery, which was, as you say, mostly in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. And of course, the British people really liked sugar. And one of the tactics that the abolitionists used was to put in place a sugar boycott. But because sugar was very popular, it certainly gave everybody in Britain, including the very many shareholders, a strong incentive to disbelieve that this industry was so brutal. And fortunately, when confronted with enough evidence, the social opinion changed enough, and Parliament did eventually, well, as you say, before too long, ban the trade. Slavery itself would continue even in those islands until I think it was the 1830s, but at least they were not bringing new African slaves over to the plantations.
And in your book that the brutality was such that 1/3 of the African slaves in the Caribbean sugar plantations perished within 3 years. 1/3.
Yeah, it was just appalling. And apparently that was a very calculated economic decision. You could either feed them better and work them less hard and have them live longer, or you could work them very, very hard and buy new slaves. And they decided that the latter approach was more economic.
Let's go to the second case study, which is radium risk and responsibility. This is pretty ghastly.
Yeah, this one was in many respects the most surprising to me because I didn't know very much about the radium industry. I mean, radium had been discovered it was discovered by the Curies in 1898, and there was a lot of attention. It was understood to be incredibly powerful, incredibly radioactive, and it was very mysterious, and it was understood to burn human flesh. And so the first use of it was to try to actually destroy cancer tumors, which made sense. But then this industry just sort of sprung up in the United States that was going to try to take advantage of all the mystique around radium and try to use it not just to destroy tumors, which you could do by positioning a little tiny bit of radium next to a tumor and then eventually it would shrink, but to try to get people to consume radium, to actually inject it into their veins or get them to drink it, because then, of course, you increase demand for radium enough to support the costs of refining it. And so by, I think it was 1913, we saw in Pittsburgh the first big radium company, which was called Standard Chemical, opening what it called the first free radium clinic, where thousands of patients went in, often for fairly minor complaints, and they would be injected with radium, or they would be given radium to drink, or they would breathe radon gas. And they were told that this would solve all kinds of medical problems. And that lasted for years. At one point, they were called before Congress, and a doctor for that company admitted that, yes, he was treating cancer patients, and yes, they did tend to die a whole lot sooner because of his radium treatments than they otherwise would have. But he admitted that in his mind, he was just shoving them over a little more quickly than they would have otherwise died.
And what years did this span before we get to the factory where young women workers were told to lick the brush?
Yeah,
what happened to them? What years before this nightmare was ended?
Well, the industry as a sort of consumer fad where people were encouraged to consume it began in the 19-teens, went through the 20s, and really started to fizzle in the 30s. The paint also began in the teens. The painting, they had radioactive paint, glow-in-the-dark paint. They would put on watch dials, and that created this enormous worker hazard, primarily for young women who were hired to apply the paint. That started around World War I. So again, in the teens, their deaths started becoming apparent in the 20s. But that industry continued into the 30s as well. And it wasn't until closer, I think, to World War II that, they stopped sticking the paintbrushes in their mouths around the 30s. And then later on, they were able to use other types of products to make that paint. So that industry kind of fizzled, not because there was necessarily a law passed against it, which makes it different than almost all these other industries where the harm was addressed legally, but because the dangers became more apparent, the newspapers were covering it, and eventually other approaches were found for the paint.
And there were some tort lawsuits, too.
There were some tort lawsuits. They tended not to deliver very much for the victims, but they did bring a lot of attention to the problem.
And just to be clear, the instruction to put the brush in their mouths as they painted the glowing numbers on the watches or the clocks, that was part of their instruction. They didn't just do that on their own, right?
Right, sure. That was how they were instructed. One of the cases, I've got a quote in the book where one of the trainers took a little tiny bit of this paint on a spatula and licked it and said, "This stuff is totally harmless." And the workers were told that radium was good for you, that if anything, it would put a glow in your cheeks, which is sort of ironic given, in fact, it caused their jaws to decay. And basically, the fact that there was this sort of quack medical fad around radium helped make possible for these women to believe that radium was, in fact, healthy for you. So licking those brushes didn't seem like such a problem.
Not good. Let's move on to the third one, which I had a role in. It's called The Nut Behind the Wheel, Car Makers Avoiding Blame for Highway Deaths. And I think our listeners are quite familiar with this. But you have a quote by a GM auto safety engineer, the chief one, in 1954. His name was Howard Gandolo. And just to show you how primitive the denial was, this is a chief safety engineer fighting seatbelt standards. And he says, quote, "Until we have substantially more information, I find it difficult to believe that the seatbelt can afford the driver any greater amount of protection over and above that which is available to him if he has his hands on the wheel and grips the rim sufficiently tight and also takes advantage of the shock-absorbing action which can be achieved by correct positioning of the feet and legs," end quote. I mean, does he have any idea of the split-second nature? Someone once pointed out you could have the strongest wrestler in the world, and the wrestler couldn't brace himself in a 15-mile-an-hour collision to not go into the windshield.
Yeah, that was one of the more jaw-dropping quotes, and I think it's important for your listeners to understand just how powerful GM was at the time, how many resources it had. It had the biggest R&D budget, I think, outside the military anywhere. And for the chief safety engineer, somebody who should know something about safety engineering, to basically have no faith in safety engineering was astonishing. And this same engineer also said that when it comes to small children, of course they want to stand on the seat and look out the window as soon as they can, because that's a lot more fun. And how he had trained his little kids the command of hands, he would say hands, and they would put their hands on the dashboard when he had to brake so that they wouldn't hurt themselves. That was how he handled this question of crash safety, that it was basically about self-help and bracing yourself, even if you're a little kid.
And for years, they would always blame the driver for everything and not the design of the motor vehicle to be crash-worthy or better highways to reduce injuries when crashes occurred. And it was just on and on into the 1940s, 1950s, until the congressional hearings in the mid to late 1960s. And that's when some brave engineers stepped forward, some doctors stepped forward, and studies from Cornell Medical School, Harvard School of Public Health began to have their impact. And I think most people don't know, Barbara, that the Pentagon is the one that funded $4 or $5 million worth of research to the Harvard School of Public Health and Cornell Medical School, because they found out that in the Air Force, the airmen were losing more lives on the highways getting back and forth from their bases than they were losing in the Korean War. And they wanted to find out why.
I think that's a good point. And then they funded this tiny little bit of crash testing research where they would either strap in animals or strap in volunteers and sort of crash into a wall and try to get some lessons there. And the idea that the auto industry itself wasn't doing this kind of research, or at least if it was, it wasn't revealing its results. That was certainly something I wanted to stress, because it's, there's the denial of would seatbelts work, that kind of basic question of fact. But then there's this kind of moral denial, the moral denial of having any responsibility for making sure that the people using your products don't die when some of them inevitably crash. And of course, Ralph, you're not mentioning your own major role in this drama. And I was happy to feature it. And I was interested when I went back and read the congressional testimony that you just very directly said, hey, it's primitive to say that we should just let the drivers hurt themselves. And if even the worst driver shouldn't necessarily pay the ultimate price for a moment of carelessness. And so I was just happy to see that so directly confronted, because that had been the approach, the philosophy the industry had taken and gotten away with for so long. It's as if they felt like, well, look, if the wheels don't come off and the brakes don't fail, we haven't caused the accident. And if we haven't caused the accident, we have zero responsibility for limiting the damage. And that was their attitude as tens and tens of thousands of people were dying on the highways.
Well, it was just at that time selling style and horsepower with lurid ads saying, if you get behind this car, you'll have your own nuclear deterrent. Just crazed inciting of especially young drivers to be aggressive. I remember as a law student in the mid-50s, I came across this Cornell Medical School research, went down to the Harvard School of Public Health and interviewed some of the scientists and human factors specialists. And I was just so excited. I wrote my third-year paper at Harvard Law School on it and turned it into a book. And all the times I talk to law students, they say, try to turn your third-year paper into some social justice cause, and you might find that it will have a lot of impact after you graduate. And so it was a good example, I think, of going out of the strict curriculum of the law school and infusing some empirical reality in the way tort law was taught, which was for decades just driver-to-driver combat who was negligent, and they ignored the role of the highway and the motor vehicle. We're going to get some of your final conclusions on all these studies just after you very briefly deal with climate crisis denial. I think our listeners are pretty familiar with it, but give a glimpse of how many years they blocked any attention to it and got away with it. Deadly years of delay.
Absolutely. Well, they, this problem has been emerging for so long. Scientists knew it was coming back, Well, we've known for centuries that these gases trap heat. We've known since the 50s that emissions were building up in the atmosphere. We've known since the late 70s that scientists have been really focusing on this. The oil industry knew certainly by the late 70s and early 80s that this was going to be a huge issue, and that basically we were going to have to stop burning fossil fuels. And so instead of taking the last 40 years and transforming themselves into something other than fossil fuel industries, they basically created as much friction as possible. The denial campaigns began mainly in the late 80s when the governments of the world started to get serious about this, and they have continued. We're at a point now where some fossil fuel companies actually no longer deny the fundamental scientific issue. I mean, ExxonMobil will say, yeah, our product is causing global warming, and we even support doing something about it, and we even support the Paris Agreement and whatnot. And yet their own projections on which they base their investments show oil sales continuing at a very high level, even though what we know from the IPCC is that we need to be slashing our emissions roughly by half in the next 10 years. And so in that sense, I think that the oil companies are kind of like the tobacco companies. They have now got to the point where after decades of denial, they don't have to deny the fundamental science anymore because they've created so many obstacles to regulation that they continue to benefit from the denials of the past, while perhaps not being quite as exposed to liability as if they continued to pretend that global warming wasn't real.
Not to mention the denier-in-chief, Trump in the White House and his Republican Party, which are still denying it, scoffing at it as massive hurricanes, floods, droughts, fires, tornadoes course through the land, and sea levels are rising. The interesting point here, and this comes to your conclusion, Barbara, is there are some pretty sizable companies that are dramatically cutting the use of fossil fuels and going to renewable energy and conservation, pre-cycling, recycling. Companies like Patagonia in California, Interface Corporation in Georgia. And one would think that their example, and they're making good money, so they've met the bottom line challenge and they are reducing toward carbon neutrality, if not having actually achieved it in the case of Interface Corporation, which manufactures tiles and is one of the world's biggest manufacturer of these kinds of tiles. Why isn't that spreading? I mean, they're making profit. They're looking real good for the planet. They're attracting very good people who want to work in socially responsible enterprises. Why doesn't this spread faster to the big guys?
Yeah, because it does spread, but it doesn't spread nearly fast enough. And I'm not really sure why that is, but obviously part of it is that for most of the country, we still have no price on carbon. Once that happens, well, a lot of other things have to happen as well. But I do think that things are going to be changing very quickly if we get Trump out of the White House and if Democrats take the Senate. And then I think we're going to find things changing very quickly, not mainly because of just an economic incentive, but because the policies will change and the very strong signal will be sent that we need to be decarbonizing as quickly as possible.
And after this enormous research, we're talking with Barbara Freese, the author of the new book, Industrial Strength Denial, 8 stories of corporations defending the indefensible, from the slave trade to climate change. What do you want to leave our listeners with in terms of looking forward, restructuring the global corporate entity, regulations, competition?
Well, to the extent that we have seen pushback on corporate denial in the past, it has been through social activism leading to legal changes. And right now, at least when it comes to climate change, we have the social activism, we have some legal changes at the state level, and obviously we need a whole lot more, including at the federal level, which means that we have to vote. And I hope in the years to come, as we are struggling with trying to push back on corporate harm, we can come up with a way to reform corporations. I'm not sure if we can do that, but more immediately, we need to strengthen the other segments of our society that can push back against corporate denial and against corporate harm. And that means social activism, it means government regulation, it means an independent media. And so I say support all those segments of our society.
There's an argument to be made that the giant corporation, having no loyalty to any country other than to exploit them and export jobs, that the giant corporation, with its enormous influence now over government's ability to move to tax havens and escape fair share of taxes, as they put it, launching technologies without any real safety risk analysis other than touting their benefits, sometimes dubiously, like biotech and nanotech and artificial intelligence, and its pell-mell production of weapons of mass destruction for dictatorial regimes and regimes that purport to be democratic, that can blow up the world, and not foreseeing and foreshadowing the kinds of perils, bacteria and viral, that we now see, that the structure, the hierarchical autocratic structure, suppressing freedom of speech and dissent, punishing whistleblowers, buying and selling governments, blocking the courts, that in their totality, Barbara, the structure of the multinational corporations' ability to exert greater and greater damage achieves omnicidal proportions, and it should be considered an antiquated, obsolete, and ferociously irresponsible system of organizing capital, labor, science, and technology. You refer in your book on page 58 that the noted cynic Ambrose Bierce in the early 20th century defined the corporation as, quote, an ingenious device for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility, end quote. You considering more fundamental replacement, displacement with other kinds of economic institutions? At the retail level, it could be cooperatives, for example. Are you starting to broach that area of research?
I haven't done much research on that. I do suggest in the book that one of the things that we might be seeing is that other institutions take over more of the processes we use to meet our human needs. And so certainly nonprofits and things like co-ops are something that could take over a much bigger role. Obviously, governments can take over a bigger role or at least more aggressively regulate the corporations. I do still wonder how we can reform corporations themselves to minimize corporate denial. I think that there hasn't been nearly enough really creative discussion about that. I mean, I think it would be very nice if someday in the future we can look back at as a time when we realized just how potentially dangerous corporations could be and figured out how to change them so that they didn't have quite so many inherent factors promoting denial of responsibility and denial of reality. I think that might take another book.
Well, for our listeners, if you're ever in a contentious exchange with free market fundamentalists, which I'm sure many of you have been, this is really your handbook. I mean, this level of saying no, and being completely wrong about it, but buying your way through decade after decade of human and property destruction by saying no, the way the corporations have. And obviously they said no to women's suffrage because women were pushing for end to child labor in dungeon factories. They said no to the abolition of slavery, as was pointed out in Barbara's book. They said no to the progressive populist movement that gave workers and farmers some power over railroads, factories, mines. They said no to Medicare and to Social Security. It's quite remarkable that an institution that says no to almost all the major justice progress in our country continues to persist and continues to be called prestigious and continues to be accorded this kind of reputational status. And that is more troubling and a form of impunity that I think scholars have to pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it is evidence of corporate power that we're not even thinking about the corporations as a human construct, as a social, legal construct that we are capable of changing.
Well, on that note, we've been talking with Barbara Freese, the author of the new book, Industrial Strength Denial. Such an important book that, of course, it wasn't reviewed by the New York Times Book Review, but that doesn't keep you from ordering it and having book club discussions in your neighborhoods and giving it to your local libraries whose budgets are strapped, and they'd be very pleased to make that part of their active collections. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Oh, thanks to you so much, Ralph. I really appreciate it.
We've been speaking with environmental lawyer and author of Industrial Strength Denial, Barbara Freese. We will link to her book at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, David Cay Johnston, Barbara Freese. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. The transcript of this show will appear on Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And you can also get Ralph's latest books, including How the Rats Reformed the Congress, if you go to ralphnaderradiohour.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our intern is Michaela Squire. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Adolph Reed, professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, who's going to talk to us about the cancel culture. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and help get this program, if you like it so much, on other radio stations in your community.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up. First, we extend our discussion with David Cay Johnston, starting with the state of Donald Trump's tax-audited returns.
Well, let's ask this countering question, David Cay Johnston. Trump has admitted to being under an ongoing audit by the IRS for years.
Well, he says he's under audit. He's never produced any evidence that he's actually under audit.
Oh, well, do you think he has been under audit? And if he has been under audit and his taxes are so sleazy in what he pays and what he doesn't pay, why hasn't the IRS sued him? Has he settled quietly?
Well, that's a very good point. And let me just point to, at DC Report, we ran a series of 5 pieces last summer about the third Koch brother, William Koch, who lives one door away from Mar-a-Lago. And we showed that he was under IRS criminal investigation. We have an email that proves he was under IRS criminal investigation. He was the only Koch brother who supported Trump. And a couple of weeks after Trump took office, the IRS stopped the investigation. Now, I don't think Trump issued an order there at all. I quoted somebody as saying that, but I believe what likely happened is the IRS bureaucrats are not stupid. They're not going to go after Donald Trump's supporter and friend when they're already completely without resources. The IRS's size is half what it was relative to the economy 10 or so years ago. Corporate auditors at the IRS cost at most $150,000 a year. They find $20 million a year in taxes due. Any normal business would say, gee, we need to hire a lot more corporate auditors. Instead, Congress has been having these people eliminated and reducing their numbers significantly. And back when William Roth was still alive, these horrible alleged taxpayer protection laws were passed on the basis of what I and others showed was utterly false testimony to Congress that deeply restrict the ability of the IRS to go after high-income people. The Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University has shown from the IRS's data that it is radically cut back on audits of high-income Americans. The Inspector General for the IRS has issued reports. The reality is they're not pursuing complex cases involving rich Americans. The Koch brother we wrote about is getting over $100 million a year tax-free by claiming that his profits from something called Petroleum Coke or Petcoke, whose the operations are in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California, are really earned in the Bahamas, where he rents a shopping center storefront of about 1,200 square feet. And then he counts these profits as additions to capital to the business, not as profits, but additions to capital, and then he takes his capital back tax-free. By the way, William Koch had no protest about our stories when they ran. I mean, I talked to his PR people, and it may be his policy he doesn't talk, but he has a reputation for suing people who write things about him that aren't true.
But didn't Donald Trump say in the 2016 campaign that he wanted to release his tax returns, but they were being audited by the IRS, and the IRS didn't say we're not auditing it? What's the real story here?
The IRS can't say that. Section 6103 of the tax code makes tax returns secret. That didn't used to be the law. In the 1920s, newspapers routinely ran stories that would say things like, Ralph Nader, the great industrialist, reported an income of $5,211,014 and paid a tax of so much. That was routinely reported back then. Congress made this all secret. He claims he's under audit, but he was unwilling to produce an audit letter. And an audit letter is an anodyne document. All it does is have your name, and it says, we're auditing your return for this year. He could be being audited over gift taxes and could claim he's under audit. But most important, Ralph, when you sign your tax return, it's called a jurat, you are testifying that it's an honest accounting of your income. Releasing the return has absolutely zero impact on anything except exposing you to people like me and others going through your tax return and showing it's fraudulent. It doesn't affect what you did with the IRS. You've signed it. It's over. It's settled. Richard Nixon was under audit when he released his tax returns. And of course, we know that Richard Nixon was, in fact, a felonious tax cheat who was saved by a pardon, and his tax lawyer went to prison.
Do you think that the IRS, given the enormous publicity about Trump's shenanigans in his business career and his entanglements domestically and foreign, didn't audit some year or two of his tax returns before he became president?
It is entirely possible that Donald Trump had some years of his tax returns audited. And Trump may have settled with the IRS, and he also may have basically threatened to make so much trouble that it would take up so much resources that the IRS, as it often does, walked away or settled for a tiny amount of money rather than looking at this as a pattern of behavior. And so long as he's president, the chances that the IRS will seriously do anything about his tax returns, even if he reported, essentially no income, are zero and none. The guy he put in to run the IRS is a Beverly Hills tax lawyer whose specialty was defending criminal tax cheats. So there's just no chance while Trump is in office. If we're going to get action on Donald Trump, it's going to come at the state level. It's going to come from New York. It's going to come from the prosecutors in Manhattan and from the New York State Attorney General, who has only civil authority unless the governor grants criminal authority to her.
Speaking to that, the culpability of the Democrats, House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Richard Neal fended off a primary challenge this week. What could he do right now?
Well, Richie Neal, who was a high school economics teacher, is fundamentally sort of a good guy, but he's a high school teacher. He's not somebody with a stiff spine who's going to stand up and take stances. I mean, if Lloyd Doggett were chairman of that committee, I think you would see it being much more active in pursuing Donald Trump, but he's not.
Could we get the tax returns right now? Could Richard Neal, the House Ways and Means Committee chair, say, the hell with the courts? I know what the law is. These are the tax returns.
Well, he's, in fact, the 1924 anti-corruption law that extended from the president to certain members of Congress the right to see anyone's tax return. Trump has the right to see your or my tax return tomorrow. He is in court fighting to get the returns. The law says that on written request of the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee or any of three other people, the tax return shall be provided. And Mnuchin has come up with these cockamamie claims that, no, we don't have to do that because it's for a purpose we don't care for. Since when does the executive branch veto on the basis of we don't like the reason you're citing, and we think even the reason you're citing is false, to withhold something? And unfortunately, the courts are slow walking this issue.
Couldn't they just arrest Mnuchin? Isn't that also baked into the law?
Absolutely, they could go do that. But Nancy Pelosi, who is after all a five-star general of strategy, she saved the Obamacare when Obama was losing it. She is smart enough to know that could backfire, and she's not going to do it. And of course, she's not going to be speaker that much longer. Nancy's in her 80s, and at some point, she will be out of there, and we will see somebody younger and newer arise into that position. If you get control of the House and the Senate under the Democrats, I think you'll see a lot of things happen. And by the way, January 20th in the afternoon, I expect that the IRS will turn over Donald Trump's tax returns to Richie O'Neill. If Richie O'Neill doesn't issue a demand and get assuming Biden takes office, an agreement with him that the minute he has taken the oath of office, he gets those tax returns, then we ought to be all over Richie Neal. Why are you not doing your job as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee?
Unless President Biden pulls an Obama and say he doesn't want to look backward.
Yeah, and I can understand if he says, I don't want the federal government to prosecute Trump. That's one thing. I understand the precedent that would set. Let the states do this. But we do not want to repeat what Obama did, where they left the criminals in charge of the banks. The share of total banking market of the too big to fail banks has grown enormously since then. We need to have reckoning, and we need to have, even if we don't have prosecutions, we need to have a full accounting of what happened, no holds barred. And if Biden backs away from that, then I would say that's really bad for the future of the Democrats. People want an accounting. They want to know what actually went on. And by the way, what they're going to find when they go in is that the records have been destroyed. Remember, we know that Donald Trump tore up the notes of a translator from one of his meetings with Putin, where the only other American in the room was the translator. That's a violation of federal law. Donald Trump has been destroying records. The National Archives, at one point, I don't know if they're still doing it, were going through his Oval Office trash can and putting documents back together that he tore up because those are criminal violations of the law. But they're going to find lots of records are not around. Donald knows how to destroy records. It's a whole chapter in my biography of him, The Making of Donald Trump, which I think is only available now as an ebook. There's a whole chapter about him destroying records and hiding records from auditors in a just farcical way. I mean, you could make a comedy out of it. It was so absurd.
For our listeners, Donald Trump has sued many critics of his to intimidate them and to stop them, but he's never sued David Cay Johnston, who is his most relentless critic in most detail. Why? Because
he knows I would get discovery and he'd lose.
Because truth is a defense. Truth is a defense against the libel suit.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last time I spoke with Donald, which was April 27th of 2016, I had sent him a series of questions about his involvement with criminals, including a major international cocaine trafficker. And let me be clear, Donald was in the cocaine trafficking business. He wasn't personally handling the drugs, but he was in league with this cocaine trafficker for whom he did extraordinary favors, like a lot of rich people who put up money with cocaine and marijuana traffickers because the returns were enormous on your investment. And he told me he was going to sue me. And I said, Donald, you're a public figure. You'd have to prove that I maliciously lied about you. And he hung up on me because he knows he could never prove that. He's tried for 32 years to show I did something wrong. He's hired very expensive lawyers and sent them to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times. And he's never gotten anywhere because I don't write things about him I can't back up. And he knows that.
Steve, anything?
Yeah, David, talk about the Republican National Convention and the Hatch Act.
Yeah, the Hatch Act is a 1939 federal anti-corruption law that says you can't use federal employees for partisan political purposes. You know, we know in places like Chicago that routinely the city government sends out city workers to do political work for the incumbent. And the president and the vice president are exempt from this law, but White House staffers are not. And the assertion by the White House that the White House staffers who helped in allowing Trump to conduct part of the Republican National Convention on the grounds of the People's House, the White House, that they were volunteers is absurd. Employment is, the courts have held, inherently a coercive position. Frankly, all of those people who worked on it, those are people I do expect will be prosecuted, or at least some of them, after this. Congress needs to pass a clear statute that you cannot use the White House for this kind of a political purpose. And there have been many, many Hatch Act cases. I have a friend who wanted to show Hatch Act violations in Chicago 50 years ago, and they finally told him he could look at the records for one day, figuring they would give him 16 bankers boxes and feed him. And as soon as they handed over the records, 25 or 30 secretaries appeared with laptop typewriters, the kind I used to carry in a little suitcase on the airplane. And they hand copied all the records, and 255 people got convicted.
David, I have to correct you on this. There's a provision in the Hatch Act that a lot of reporters miss, that if Trump instructed White House staff, just as he instructed Treasury employees to put his name on
That's a defense.
Yeah. He is also violating the Hatch Act. He's not exempted. So
okay, if he instructed them, I'm sure that's the case. But Donald will always claim, no, they volunteered. Of course, when the mob boss tells you he needs something done, you don't need a gun put to your head or a pen.
That's right.
You get the message.
The acceptance speech by Donald Trump in the event at the White House was a federal crime scene. He forced White House staff to prepare all the grounds, etc., and he was involved, and he involved his family. And when his chief assistant, Mark Meadows, was asked about this being a violation of the Hatch Act, he said, nobody cares about this act out there. These are lawless lawbreakers like the country's never seen.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I've been rewatching The West Wing. It's amazing how things haven't changed. And there's a scene about it where President Bartlett has to raise some money for the congressional elections in between, and he insists on going to the residence to do it. He won't do it from the Oval Office because it's improper. Donald has no sense of anything like that. There is no right or wrong in Donald. There is only, how do I win? What's in it for me? And the only difference between Donald and our notion of a traditional mob boss is that Donald doesn't have people break legs and shoot people. He uses an ink pen and intimidation. He's the head of a white-collar crime family, and there are a lot of white-collar crime families in America. One of the biggest stories that the news media really doesn't get onto, partly because enormous legal exposure in general in such matters, and because our laws are so weak, they've created these opportunities, and Trump knows that. Donald is, you got to admire in a perverse way that the guy knows how to exploit the weaknesses and the loopholes in the system for his benefit, and he's never been held accountable for any of this. I mean, this is a man who had teenagers who were in his casinos, and they were plied with liquor and limousines, and he didn't lose his casino license. He's gotten away with this stuff his whole life, and the explanation for that is he's very good at evading the law, but the laws are too weak. They're tissue. They should be iron. And when you get the privilege of a corporation, you should be held accountable. I think maybe strictly accountable, which is a legal concept, but you should be accountable for misconduct.
Well, you can see how standards in the White House have totally collapsed compared to the days when Sherman Adams, the chief of staff for President Eisenhower, accepted a vicuna, quote, as a gift from a textile manufacturer in New England, and he was forced to resign just because he accepted a vicuna. That's a great example. Sherman
Adams had to resign over bupkis compared to what Donald Trump has done. And look at all the money we've poured into the Trump organizations, and I'm sure we're going to find out that the records have to exist for this. The Secret Service, I'll bet you, pays full retail for every golf cart they rent from Donald Trump. They pay full retail for meals and rooms and everything else at his properties. That's another thing. Congress needs to pass a law that says that not $1 of taxpayer money can be spent at commercial properties owned by any future president. That's an easy law to pass. I would think that even the most troglodyte Republicans would be in favor of that if you simply postured as protecting the taxpayer from being exploited.
Before we leave, we don't usually ask our interviewees predictions, but who's going to win the election?
Well, Joe Biden will win the popular vote. I had been saying he'd win by at least 16 million. I think he'll win by at least 20 million votes, but that doesn't mean he wins. All Trump has to do is suppress the vote and get miscounts of the vote and challenge ballots in key states. And through the Electoral College, he can pull it off again. So I've been telling everybody who asks me what to do, there's an enormous sense of powerlessness among Americans. The whole empowerment movement of the 60s seems to have just disappeared. I tell people, find an election in a state where it's Trump can win or Biden can win, volunteer for a congressional campaign, sign up now, reserve a hotel room wherever it is, drive or fly there the Sunday before the election, and do whatever they want you to do. Drive people to the polls, call people on the phone. If lawyers and paralegals like crazy need to be available, because there are going to be lots of challenge ballots, and mark my word, there will be armed men standing in some polling places just outside the perimeter for not politicking to suppress the vote. You will see this, and it's going to be a real issue as to whether Trump can succeed in just afflicting the vote, and I do mean afflicting the vote, in enough jurisdictions to win a second term in the Electoral College.
How can people read more of what you're writing, David Cay Johnston?
Well, DC Report, singular, dcreport.org, is a nonprofit, non-advertising news service. The people who put it together with me are former senior people at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and the LA Times. We have writers who get little tiny honoraria because we're supported entirely by donors. But many of the big stories you read about Trump, we can trace back to weeks, months, in one case 3 years before they appeared on the nightly news on the networks.
To repeat that for our listeners, dcreport.org.
And now Ralph takes Barbara Freese through a few more chapters in her book.
Before I ask you to summarize the 8 case studies, what was amazing about this to readers who are not familiar with the ravages of corporate history is that a lot of these industries are still operating, if not in the same form, in different form. For example, the oil industry, which had its investments in the tetraethyl lead company, Ethyl Corporation, the auto industry, another one, the financial industry, the tobacco industry. The stocks are doing well for Philip Morris, renamed. How do you explain how a society can survive when individuals can have their reputations damaged and their livelihoods extinguished if they behave the same way? Lying, consequence, people dying, denial, final admission. Some individuals go to jail, but you can't imprison the corporation. But how can a society survive divided by individual accountability and corporate impunity, even if, they have to pay up? It's the cost of doing business.
Right. Well, yeah, you've gone right to the heart of it here, haven't you, Ralph? Clearly, this is an illustration of how individuals are treated much differently than corporations. And when these sorts of harms are done in a corporate name, maybe some individuals will go to jail. Often, even that's not the case, but the industries themselves survive. Out of the 8 that I looked at, I guess the only 2 that didn't survive were the slave trade and the radium industry. But all of the others have continued on and have been pretty much thriving, although at least CFCs are no longer being marketed, but the chemical industry and the aerosol industries that were marketing them in the first place are still obviously there. Yeah, it poses an enormous threat to society, and it's something we absolutely have to get a handle on.
Yeah, I meant to define individual as outside the protective cover of corporations like CEOs and so forth. They get away with it, but just individuals that don't have a corporation wrapped around them often have to be held quite accountable. I remember, and we all do, the differential sentencing years ago. 2 Native Americans were accused of stealing a horse in Colorado and were sentenced to 15 years in jail. We all know about the marijuana possession sentences, sometimes for 30 years in jail for possessing a little marijuana. So I want to now have our listeners listen very carefully to the summaries of 5 case studies, and are they ever footnoted, that Barbara Freese has brought together. And it'll give you an education in corporate crime and corporate abuse and corporate arrogance and corporate control of science and corporate blockage of regulation and basically forcing their own workers to follow this nefarious corporate party line. Anyway, let's move on to the next one in your book, Industrial Strength Denial by Barbara Freese. And the next one is How Wrong One Can Be, Bias, Tribalism, and Leaded Gasoline.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when I did the research into this one too, because I hadn't realized what a very prominent debate there had been in the 1920s about whether or not to put lead into the gasoline. It was done initially upon a discovery made at GM when they realized that if you put a little bit of tetraethyl lead, a very toxic chemical, into the gasoline, it would reduce knocking, and so you could build bigger engines. And so it was something they really wanted to do. But even then, lead had been understood, really for thousands of years to be something that affected the brain and that poisoned the brain. And it was already a very conspicuous, probably the most conspicuous industrial poison. So the idea of putting it into the fuel supply and spreading it out everywhere raised a lot of alarm among the public health experts at the time. And they contacted GM, and the Surgeon General wrote and said in a fairly timid way, gee, is this really such a good idea? And the industry basically said, yeah, don't worry. It's probably not going to even be a measurable amount of lead. And plus, you can trust us to keep public safety foremost, and we'll keep a close eye on this. And it did actually end up in the headlines, especially in New York, because of some very dramatic worker poisonings that happened again in the 1920s, where workers exposed at a Standard Oil facility in New Jersey actually suffered what the papers called violent insanity as a result of being exposed to tetraethyl lead. And so, of course, the New York newspapers covered that very, very lurid story. And that then also led to more attention to what happens to the whole world if you put lead into the gasoline. And then there was a Surgeon General's conference where they brought together the industry and public health folks. This was a one-day conference, so it's not like they spent a whole lot of time on it. But basically, that's where the industry said, trust us, we need to do this. This stuff is a gift of God. We need it to develop our technology. We need it for progress. And we're going to study this technology. And we're going to keep an eye on it. And we'll certainly step up and stop production if there's any problem.
Even though, by the way, Barbara, the toxicity of lead goes back to the Roman Empire when they had lead in some of their containers and poisoned a lot of people. And the lead is still with us. It's Flint, Michigan, in the drinking water. A curse that keeps popping up here and there. We got it out of lead-based paint 30 years ago or so you don't have to worry about paint now having lead. And I guess the tetraethyl lead was gradually restricted. People could choose leaded gasoline. And then it was, I guess in the late 70s, it was banned. And there's just no remorse here.
Right. The ethyl company, the company that was formed to make and market this product, basically moved on. First of all, they moved on to marketing their product in other countries. And then eventually they moved on to marketing other things. But yeah, you don't find in this book a lot of folks who are saying, gee, we're really sorry we poisoned millions of people, or we destroyed millions of lives through financial crisis, or we killed millions of people from smoking tobacco. That's not a prominent feature of any of these stories.
And it's such a silent violence destroyer, especially with children, affects their brain. And anyway, this is a very gripping part of your book. The next one we can move a little quicker in the interest of time. This is the chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, that depleted the ozone. And before those were banned under an international treaty, these are the aerosols people used to use. They'd buy them in the stores and they'd squirt various liquids and aerosols in their home. And it was very easy to replace it with a technology. But the stunning thing in your chapter is in 1977, not long before the CFCs were banned, George Diamond, president of Diamond Aerosol, a company in industry, said this, quote, "My theory is that the whole thing is orchestrated by the Ministry of Disinformation of the KGB in Moscow to damage our economy and our faith in democratic government," end quote. Why don't you quickly describe, Barbara, how damaging it is to the ozone and how it was eliminated by the Montreal Protocol and how simple the substitution was?
Sure. Well, yes. I mean, basically what happens with CFCs, which were used as a propellant and in refrigeration and air conditioning, is that they eventually get up to the stratosphere. They're blasted by ultraviolet radiation. The chlorine in the CFCs is released, and then that destroys the ozone in this sort of complicated chemical reaction. And this was actually theorized and discovered and figured out by a couple of independent scientists from academia, Sherwood Rowland and Dr. Molina, and they said, hey, this could be a really big problem, but nobody detected it yet. And so it was kind of theoretical. It took a few years before the ozone hole was discovered, and people got really alarmed about it in the 80s. But back in the 70s, the first stage of this debate was just, should we have this in our aerosols, which were largely being used for deodorant and hairspray. And as you say, they were easily replaced. So in the 70s, even when there was still doubt about whether this problem was real, we still had a federal government willing to say, let's just get this out of the aerosols, and gave the industry 2 years to do it. It was no big deal. They got it out of there. Even though, as you say, the aerosol industry very much considered this to be an anti-capitalist plot. The harder part was getting it out of the air conditioning and the refrigeration. That took more research in the 80s, and that's again when the ozone hole was discovered in Antarctica. That fortunately led to the Montreal Protocol, this international treaty, and we did, in fact, phase CFCs out. Some of the replacement chemicals had their own problems, but we were able to, basically react like a sort of rational species and come together and say, okay, this is causing a huge problem. Let's get rid of this chemical. We'll replace it with other things. And the ozone layer has been healing now, so it'll take some time. But this could be seen as, while it took quite a while, a real success story in our ability to detect the harm that we're causing and to try to address it. Unfortunately, it also led to a political backlash that has been preventing us from dealing with climate change, a very anti-scientific political backlash on the right.
And it sort of blocked the necessity for international treaties like this in the whole climate catastrophe arena, even though it was a success story. That's part of the corporate syndrome, the fact that even success stories don't change the rugged commitment to digging in and denying in the name of profits. Your chapter on tobacco's mass production of denial, listeners should be reminded that year after year, tobacco took over 400,000 American lives. Tobacco-related diseases, as determined by study after study from the U.S. Surgeon General's office in the U.S. government, drawing on thousands of studies worldwide. Give us briefly the denial motif here by the industry.
There was a lot there, but I'll just try to hit some of the highlights. Of course, they focused always on proof, right? They would keep the burden of proof on those alleging there was a harm, and they would never acknowledge that the amount of evidence was enough, even when it became absolutely ridiculous to continue to deny the connection between tobacco and cancer and heart disease and other forms of other deadly diseases. But they also did an awful lot of other things. They pointed to, for example, other causes of cancer. They basically tried to argue that it was something about the individual, their genetics, maybe their personality, their stress, that both made them want to smoke and made them prone to get lung cancer. They argued that they were defending individual freedom against basically fascism. They frequently considered tobacco laws tantamount to fascism. And they also, and this is maybe the thing we're still dealing with now, they also kind of mustered various arguments, including other industries, against the government and against science itself by attacking the Surgeon General. There's this bizarre claim from 1986 from the Tobacco Institute accusing the Surgeon General of scientific censorship and claiming that scientific integrity was at stake. And of course, by 1986, The Tobacco Institute was already a joke when it came to anything they would have to say about the science of tobacco, and yet they claimed to be defending scientific integrity. And I think the tobacco industry played a big role in helping attack government science, certainly any science that regulators rely on, and helped create this incredible cynicism that it so much characterizes our politics today and interferes with our ability to deal with things like climate change.
And the rollback's quite impressive, too. We never had more than 1,000 people working full-time in this country, doctors, lawyers, public health specialists. And here's the result. In 1964, when the Surgeon General's report came out, about 46 to 47% of all adults smoked regularly every day. And now it's about 16% and still dropping. That's really another success story of rolling back an addiction without prohibition, as we tried and failed in our country's history with the constitutional amendment on prohibiting the production and consumption of alcoholic products starting back in the 1920s. Your next one is called Bottom Line, Nothing Else Matters.
Right. And this one is about the financial industry and the financial crisis of 2008 and about, well, first of all, this new breed of lenders that were selling subprime mortgages to some of the most financially unsophisticated of Americans, and also about Wall Street and how they strongly encouraged and enabled these subprime mortgages, how they then packaged them and sort of manipulated the ratings agencies into giving them big ratings, high, safe ratings. And then, of course, they could sell those highly rated investment packages to investors and basically create this enormous river of toxic debt and have it spread all around the world until inevitably the housing bubble burst. And suddenly there was all of this debt out there, and the global financial system took a nosedive, and the government had to end up stepping in and doing things that ultimately proved very controversial, but at least kept the system rolling.
And nobody went to jail.
Yeah, very few people went to jail. I think one person from Wall Street, which you can contrast that with the savings and loan crisis of some years earlier, where something like 1,000 bankers were convicted of felonies. In this case, there was only one banker from a major Wall Street firm that was convicted of a crime, and he was kind of a bit player. And one of the federal regulators talked about how basically it was just very hard to get the folks at the top in Wall Street to criminally convict them, because they would sort of put in place these systems that just made it much harder to establish that those at the top really knew what they were doing. So
whereas in the savings and loan crisis, where there was a lot of shenanigans and crimes, 10 or so years earlier, I think about 800 people were prosecuted and given jail terms. No, in the 2008-9, the prosecutors decided to focus on Martha Stewart for insider trading. They sent her to jail for a couple of years. This is a trend that's very disturbing in that as corporate crimes increase in magnitude, severity, and penetration of people's livelihoods, the penalties and the prosecutions have been declining in pronounced way, especially under Donald Trump, as documented by a Public Citizen report recently. It's like the federal government is giving out wholesale get-out-of-jail cards, and the issue of impunity and immunity of the giant corporation, I'm sure, is going to produce more books like yours, Barbara.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to political science professor Adolph Reed about race versus class and the cancel culture. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting